everybody's getting settled, let's, because I like videos, and I think you do too, let's take a look at another video, just a few minutes of this one, The Cost of Winning. All right, well, that's a perfect segue since we seem to end every discussion with a picture of Sean's cover from Time, to welcome you to the afternoon session of our day of discussing the costs of professionalizing youth sports. And we deliberately chose that title because it's not just money and it's not just physical. There's a lot of things that go into where we are in terms of youth sports, and so we want to talk about that with the people that know it best. So I am extremely excited to welcome this panel. So first, I'd like to introduce Tom Ferry, who I'm thrilled to welcome. He's a pioneering journalist, analyst, and social entrepreneur whose leadership has created breakthrough opportunities for stakeholders throughout the sport and health sectors. He's the author of the book Game On, the All-American Race to Make Champions of Our Children. And he's founded the Aspen Institute's Sports and Society program, the mission of which is to convene leaders, facilitate dialogue, and inspire solutions that help sports serve the public interest. Tom's a former journalist. He, of course, worked for ESPN and became the first reporter to really conceptualize and deliver cross-platform enterprise reporting. At the Aspen Institute, he's explored the connections between sport and the largest themes in society, including education, globalization, technology, race, and ethics. He's best known for advancing dialogue around college and youth sports with The Nation, and writing in 2017, Tom has done more than any reporter in the country to educate all of us about the professionalization of youth sports. Game On, which I just finished, is an investigation of contemporary youth sports and has been used as a text on many college campuses. And the Project Play reports that you co-authored have been used by many organizations to shape strategy and introduce youth programs. So big welcome to Tom Ferry. I'm also very excited to welcome Mark Hyman, who is teaching assistant professor of management at George Washington University School of Business. He's a national expert on the business of youth sports and the culture of highly competitive youth sports in America. His published books include Concussion of Our Kids, America's leading expert on how to protect young athletes and keep sports safe, with Robert Cantu, The Most Expensive Game in Town, The Rising Cost of Youth Sports and the Toll on Today's Families, and Until It Hurts, America's Obsession with Youth Sports and How It Harms Our Kids. He's a frequent public speaker and a journalist. And I just love this, that he said if he could pull one quote from his reporter's notebook for posterity, it would be Frank Jobe, the late orthopedic surgeon, who said of overused youth pitchers, no pain, no gain. I'd like to punch the guy who said that. And that takes us to Sean Gregory, who Mark asked me at lunch what was the catalyst for this program, and I think for a lot of us it was the cover story that Sean did for Time magazine on the cost of professionalizing youth sports. I will never get Joey Baseball out of my mind. So he's a senior writer for Time, covering sports for the magazine and Time.com. He's been there since 2002 and written profiles on athletes like Usain Bolt, LeBron James, Tim Tebow, Novak Djokovic, Maria Sharapova, excuse me. My Russian's not that good. Also written enterprise features on the Penn State football child sex scandal, baseball in the Dominican Republic, the recruiting of preteen athletes by major college sports programs. Prior to joining Time, Sean worked as the Associated Press, WFAN in New York, and he also spent 3 years writing for a major financial services company in New York. So I welcome all three of them. Can we give them a big round of applause, please? So I'm curious, how many of you played sports in high school? Okay, so I assume that means that you played it in junior high as well? Elementary school? Okay. How many of you are professional athletes? Well, that seems odd. It certainly seems, with the focus that we've had on the direction where youth sports have gone so far, that the majority of you should have become professional athletes or who played college? Okay, Division I? Division II? Division III? All right, so I'm really curious about this. So maybe we could just start by kind of looking at, in 1989, Michigan State asked 2,800 boys and girls around the country why they play sports, and I think you guys know what the answer is going to be. They said that it was fun, and they said it was something they were good at, but we've somehow lost track of that. Can you guys, and maybe Tom, you could start us. When did we lose track of this? When did it become less about kids having fun and more about whether or not they could get college scholarships or have pro aspirations?
Well, there's no one reason. That's why I took 384 pages of my book to kind of get to the bottom of it. But I would say that the what happened was the incentives and the disincentives around sport participation grew and became more apparent. And what I mean by that is in the early 1990s, the NCAA member schools handed out about $250 million in athletic aid. Well, now, according to the NCAA, it's about $3 billion in athletic aid. So it's still, the odds are still incredibly long in playing at the D1 level or even the D3 level. And there's really not as much scholarship money as parents think is out there right now. I mean, I know that as the father of a college athlete myself, you know. But I think what happened is parents began to see the potential return on investment. And that is what has driven the formation of these travel teams, pushing down until second grade or otherwise. A kid will be 7 years old and they will show some potential, and some parent will get their ideas around, well, let's see. If I have them focus on the sport, if I put them with a private trainer, if I get them with the right coach or club team, we do the camps, we do the out-of-state tournaments, we get them slotted into a pipeline where they could get that college scholarship, maybe even be a professional athlete. Or if you're from an upper income family, and this is another factor as well, is preferential admission to highly selective colleges. You may not need the money to get into that college, but parents are trying to game their system and create every opportunity for their kids possible, are saying, well, if my kid can get recruited by, an Ivy League school, or, my son plays for Babson College, one of those highly selective kind of colleges, and he did get in because of his soccer. He was recruited by the team. Then that's an advantage as well, and therefore we will write those $3,000 checks. And that is what changed. The youth sport landscape has been transformed by the chase for the athletic scholarship. On the disincentive side, we become increasingly aware, starting around 2000 or so, about the obesity crisis. And nobody wants their kid to be that kid who's left on the couch and is not physically active. So parents are incentivized to make sure they get in the game and they stay in the system in some way or another. So even if they're not from that wealthier home where it's easy to stroke that $3,000 check, if you love your kid, you're going to do everything you can to make sure they're part of this institution that has, can produce, when served up well, many rewards. It can develop healthy habits for life. It can get you in the right social group. You're around kids who have some direction. There are a lot of reasons why we have prioritized sport, and then what that has done is that's turned it into a real industry, which Sean wrote about so well in the cover magazine, and Mark has written about quite eloquently in his multiple books. I only wrote one. He's written, 7, 10, 15, whatever, on his way. He's written a lot. So I think that's what's driven it. I look at this as an economist would look at this space. I don't think there's a failure of morality or culture. I think the structure and the economy of youth sports have changed, and that has driven behavior.
So I think Tom is right that it's not one factor, and there's not a point in time that you can point to as the moment that youth sports kind of got out of hand. I think of it more as kind of a global warming of youth sports, and every year the temperature ticks up a degree in ways that we're not really aware of at the time, but you look back and you see the differences. Let me cite one example of this global warming effect. The Little League World Series, which is a guilty pleasure for me. I love to watch the Little League World Series, is a national television event, as we know. And Disney pays, well, in 2013, they signed a 10-year deal with Little League Baseball to televise the Little League World Series for $7.5 million a year. And it's not just the Little League World Series, and it's not just the portion of the tournament that takes place in Williamsport. Disney and ABC and ESPN, they're televising 100 national television broadcasts of 100 Little League games in the month of August. 100. So, I mean, who benefits from this? The network, clearly. Sponsors who are buying time. Countless business enterprises that are connected to the broadcasts of the game. But if you ask a pediatrician or a sports medicine expert, and I have, whether it's a good idea, whether they would recommend for your 11-year-old kid to be playing baseball in front of 2 million people on national TV, you're going to find it difficult to find a medical professional to endorse that idea for your kid. So it seems like kind of a benign thing, but I think we've lost sight to some extent of who youth sports or what youth sports are really about and who they're serving. And to me, the Little League World Series, which again, I enjoy watching, is a prime example of that. Is it really about us as adults and what we want from youth sports, or is it really in the interest of kids?
Well, I wonder, and I definitely want you to jump in. It almost feels like we're like the lobster in the pot, though, that it's not per se global warming. It's like it's heating up around us, or the frog, I guess. You know how it heats up and you don't realize. And I'm wondering if, you mentioned, Sean, that you didn't realize how big this story was going to get. Can you talk a little bit about how big it got, and why do you think it resonated so much, and what surprised you the most in the research that you did?
Yeah, I think it's resonated because it's a story that a lot of parents go through. I have an 11-year-old boy and a 9-year-old boy, and so people live it, have lived it, are living it, and it's this kind of part of life that takes up a lot of psychic energy, financial resources, time management. It really affects every part of you, and you don't realize it until you're in it. So, and there's no manual for it, I first became a father in 2006, and I had no idea, like, when my kid took his first layup in first grade, I went online and clicked for just maybe there's a little local clinic for him or something, and I discovered there's a first grade, second grade national championship. Like, I had no idea, and that actually happened, and I think we know a lot. So just with the global warming, I'm going to screw up this metaphor. If youth sports professionalizing it's happening at a global, then I think our digital world is the carbon monoxide. You know what I mean? Like, I think that the digital world that we live in has fueled this fire tremendously. Just for example, there's this company called CoachUp, and it's basically an Uber for private coaching. You can, at your fingertips, you can basically order a private basketball, football, soccer coach, whatever, baseball coach. They're around. I'm sure if you got this app today and you wanted to do it locally, it's as easy as an Uber. So, and when technology evolves where businesses evolve, then money comes in. So youth sports is attracting a lot of investment from Silicon Valley investors. And nothing speaks to the professionalization of youth sports than Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, has bought into a company that's basically trying to become, the monopoly of youth sports. The company called Blue Star Sports, which is buying up small technology companies that do things like, arrange scheduling, private coaches, video technology, where 7th grade basketball players can get statistical feedback like NBA players do. I mean, those kind of things, like live streaming. I was in South Korea with Tom covering the Olympics, and I was watching my son's CYO semifinal championship game on my phone. So, I mean, these things, it's becoming, when it's easy to participate because of technology, it's just going to fuel the fire. But yeah, as far as the story, it's been I think it just resonates, and it takes up more of your life than you realize it until you're in it.
One of the most interesting things about all of us sitting up here is we all seem fairly aware of the challenges, but yet all of us have kids. I mean, Mark, I was so mesmerized in your book about how honest you are about, having your son pitch and not wanting
Don't
to...
bring that. Don't
read Mark's book and learn about his son. But we've all been in the same situation where you called CYO basketball old-fashioned, and
Yeah.
so, you know, my son, of course, has to play travel hockey in my case, or travel soccer, or travel baseball, and you know, you don't think about the problems that could arise until even while they're arising, you can justify them. So, Tom, I'm curious, you know, especially through the work that you're doing with Project Play, what's wrong with us? I mean, why can't we see the forest for the trees in this struggle to help our kids stay healthy, try to fight obesity? We know that kids are stopping organized sports at the age of 11, so we're obviously not succeeding in a lot of ways. What have we done wrong as parents, or what are we missing that's allowing us to go down this pathway?
Well, I would say it's not just parents who are stakeholders here. There's sort of two failures, and we do a lot of thinking about this through Project Play, and which Mark has been involved with as well. There's sort of a failure of top-down leadership, and there's a failure of or ignorance from the bottom up, right? So what I mean by that is failure of top-down leadership. The organizations that are creating the policies and the practices and the structures around youth sports have, I think, largely failed to create an environment that is going to meet the needs, that is going to create a youth sport experience that is consistent with athletic development and child development literature, right? So, you know, the U.S. Olympic Committee is trying to get active in that way right now, but it hasn't been their priority. The national governing bodies have largely been focused on elite athletes. There's been sort of a neglect of the youth sport, community sport environment, creating standards, holding people accountable to those standards, pushing coach education, parent education down the pipeline. We're working with a lot of those organizations now. There's a lot of really good people who are sincerely trying to make efforts in that space, but it's like turning an oil tanker and changing the whole paradigm. It just doesn't happen overnight. Secondly, from the bottom up, parents are lost. They basically just love their kid and they want the best for their kid. And where do they get their information from? They get it from the person they're sitting next to at the game, and it's not Mark Hyman and it's not Sean Gregory. You know, it's another person who's absolutely guessing at what's right and what's wrong, and they don't know, and they just sort of go with it. And they don't know what quality athletic development looks like. They don't know about the role of physical literacy in building an athlete. They don't know what it takes to become an elite athlete, that most of them did play multiple sports, that, you know, they had good coaches along the way, they got lucky, that they're actually kind of just special too. I mean, those who make it to the pro level, yeah, they all work really hard, but they were born with a different piece of clay than most people. I mean, if you talk to sports scientists, I mean, they're special in 2 or 3 different kinds of ways. I mean, they're in the top 1/10 of 1% in, pick the traits: flexibility, court vision, you know, meaning the ability to process patterns in front of you, strength, height, and we see it most dramatically in basketball. If you're tall, you got a chance to play at a high level. If you don't, much more difficult. I mean, genetics actually really do matter. You can't just take this American idea that you can manufacture an elite athlete out of any piece of clay is complete and total bunk, and it's a narrative that is pushed by a lot of the media companies. It's this wonderful, you know, story of, you know, working hard, and the world you can do anything you want if you work hard. Well, yeah, sorta, not really, you know. So I think there needs to be a lot more top-down leadership, and then parents need to be empowered. I mean, we've created these what we call Project Play parent checklists for kids between the below age 12, 0 to 5 for kids. You know, 10 questions you should ask yourself, your child, and your local sport provider. 6 to 12 for kids who are playing sports, and 6 to 12 kids who are stuck on the couch. Parents don't know the 10 questions to ask. You know, what do you want to play this season? When you talk to the local program, are your coaches trained? And what key competencies? Do you allow multi-sport play? Okay, what do you do? What kind of policies do you have to promote that? I mean, they're completely and totally lost. So they want to be good advocates for their kids, but they're not empowered to do so. So I think this can be fixed. I would not have signed up. I would not have kind of gotten out of journalism to some degree. I wouldn't have signed up for Project Play if I didn't think we could actually make real progress. We can. It's just going to take time.
You believe it, Mark?
Well, there are 2 points I'd like to make. Number one, we are not the first generation of ridiculous sports parents. And when you do a little research into the history of bad behavior among parents in sports, you realize that this is kind of baked in. This is part of our DNA as parents. And there are examples going back 100 years of parents not 100 years, 70 years of parents behaving very badly in the context of their kids' youth sports lives. So I think that's important to note, a little perspective. The other point that I wanted to make is that we're listening to the wrong people as parents. We're listening to the batting coach and the combine promoter and the people who have an economic stake in our consuming and spending on youth sports instruction and camps and a variety of services. Yes, we ought to pay attention to what those folks are saying, but as a parent, I'm interested in what my pediatrician is saying and what the sports medicine doc is saying and the orthopedic surgeon. And there are lots of resources out there that I think can be a very helpful guide with respect to setting limits and providing kind of a framework for when is specialization a good idea and how many pitches should my kid be throwing in the season? How many months a year is it safe for my child to be a youth pitcher? There's a website that I would recommend to everyone in this room called stopsportsinjuries.org. And it is a website that was created by a group of sports orthopedic surgeons. And they have a dedicated page for not every sport, 35 sports. And each page provides a kind of prescriptive list of what is safe for your kid, what is unsafe by age, by gender, really valuable information. That's where I want to get that's the kind of information that I'm going to rely on. And, not to discount your friends, as Tom says, who are sitting next to you in the grandstand, but I think it's important to consider where the information that you're relying on is coming from and what the interests of those people are who are giving you the advice.
I mean, we've all heard the idea that it takes 10,000 hours to develop expertise in something. So it seems logical if I'm a parent, and I've mentioned to you my admiration for Joey Baseball and his parents, who was featured in Sean's story. And, clearly that kid loves baseball. His parents love baseball. His dad's spending $30,000 a year. To become an elite pitcher or elite player doesn't he need to put in 10,000 hours? How do you balance these techniques that we know lead people to success with, and I feel judgmental when I look at him and his family, like, what are you doing to this poor 10-year-old child? But he clearly has a talent and they're clearly offering him opportunity.
Yeah, with the 10,000-hour rule, I mean, there's plenty of research out there that suggests the opposite when it comes to sports. I mean, the research is pretty clear. The earlier you specialize, the more likely you are to get hurt, the more likely you are to burn out. There's also research out there that's pretty clear and convincing and compelling that free play, unstructured play is very helpful. In Australia, for example, they did a study that you're more likely to make the Australian Olympic team if you participated in unstructured sports, just playing around, being a kid, essentially. UCLA put out a study that 88% of their college scholarship athletes played 2 to 3 sports in high school. So there's evidence that if you don't, stay away from specialization. Now, and in fairness, in some sports like golf and figure skating, gymnastics, very, very technical individual sports, it might be a different story. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of evidence out there that suggests what people are doing is counterproductive to getting, if college scholarship is your aim, being 8, 9 years, putting your 8 or 9-year-old in 12-month-a-year travel sports in one sport, the research says don't do that, but people do it anyway, because people just don't know, and and the human instinct to, especially if your kid likes the game. I mean, that's if your kid likes doing it, has friends. There's hey, maybe that's his big time or her big time sports experience, and that's fine too.
I think you all cited Tiger Woods as an example of the extreme nature of how we can, demonstrate a kid's prowess. And he was 2 years old on the Mike Douglas show, which I don't know how many people remember the Mike Douglas show. And so obviously that message was transmitted to a whole generation of people that you could take your toddler, and we talked at lunch about how our kids showed these proclivities to throw a ball or play hockey or whatever at a certain age. Why wouldn't I do that? I mean, is that kind of where we've changed? It feels like that's a moment in history when things started to shift in a whole different direction. The Williams sisters, Tiger Woods, we look at those examples and we say, that worked, I can do that too.
Well, for one thing, is Tiger Woods the icon that we want to hold up with respect to?
I got a question about morals later. So
I mean, I think that's a legitimate question to ask. There's a price to be paid. There's a price to pay for living that kind of childhood. And the other point that I think is important, and I think Sean and Tom would agree, for every Tiger Woods, for every parent who raised their kid as Earl Woods raised Tiger, there are a million parents who did exactly the same thing, but we don't really hear about them because those kids were out of the sport at age 12. They hate their parents. They've never played golf since they were 12 and a half. And that's not really a template that we really want to follow either. So, yeah, you can look at Tiger Woods as an example of what's possible if you have a laser focus on raising a champion. I think it's really an example of quite the opposite, the risks and the reasons not to view sports as a career path for your kid.
There's a real opportunity cost to intense youth sports specialization, playing. You could be spending that time in the classroom. And there's an economist at Utah State, I believe, Travis Dorsch, who was a former Big Ten kicker at Purdue. He's done a lot of anecdotal work just speaking to so many parents who spent north of 6 figures on youth sports. You could have put that money into a college fund. I mean, he makes the point a lot. So there's empirical data. As more people look into this, there's going to be more empirical data kind of showing the opportunity cost of youth sports.
Yeah, I like in our sports system now, it's like throwing eggs against a wall and seeing which ones don't break. So Tiger Woods didn't break, at least until things went wrong around age 30 or so, right? So, but lots of them break. So as a parent, do you want to throw your child against the wall and see if they break or not? I mean, it's not a sustainable system. I mean, if, and it's not what you want for your kids. I think it's problematic, and I think Americans respond to stories and anecdotes. We love storytelling in this country. We're much more skeptical of research. One of the things, Sean and I were in Korea and Norway. Norway kicked ass. I mean, nation of 5.2 million people, about the size of Greater Detroit. Okay, they won more Olympic medals than any nation in the history of the Winter Games. The U.S. finished 4th. We got more people on skis than they do. We got more people in winter sports than they do. They produce the most elite athletes in the world. Okay, and yet if you look at the base of their sports system, they're not throwing eggs against the wall. What they did is they redesigned their sports system 30 years ago. When they didn't do well in the Olympics in 1988, 5 medals, 0 golds, went back and said, all right, we got to change things here. And they adopted sport for all policies. They said, okay, we have a limited population. We're going to invest in everybody. The most important athlete in the system is the child athlete, not the one at the top of the pyramid. Not that they neglected what needed to happen at the top of the pyramid. But they said, okay, look, we need to get it right at 12 and under, to the point, and Sean wrote about it as well, where it needs to be development focused as opposed to winning focused, and to the point where yes, people keep score in their head and everything, but if you as a club register that score on a website or in a newspaper, or put it up on a scoreboard or otherwise, you literally get kicked out of your out of your federation. That's how seriously they take the idea of development at an early age. And the whole concept is we need to invest in physical literacy and love of game with every kid. And as they move into the teenage years, the kids are going to find the right sport, or they're going to find whether they want to go after the Olympics or they want to just recreate. But it works. Enough of them go on to the elite sports that they do very well in the Olympics now, and they have the healthiest nation in the world. The healthiest nation in the world. That is a system. That is a sports system that makes sense. That's what good looks like in youth sports. That's something that serves the health of communities. We don't have that concept in this country. We're still in love with this idea of identifying the next generation of athlete entertainers at very early ages, sorting the weak from the strong well before they grow into their bodies, their minds, and their interests. And it's just foolishness, because we put all of our eggs in the, going back to the egg metaphor here, sorry, I'm mixing them a little bit, but we basically invest in those kids who show potential at 8, 9, and 10 years old, load them up with year-round play, camps, the whole darn thing, pressure, and they're the ones who are subjected to burnout and the overuse injuries and so forth. And then we push all the other kids, we structurally push all the other kids aside and say, you're not really an athlete. You're not even good enough athlete to play at the high school level, get playing time for your local soccer team. Well, in Norway, they respect research. They fund research, and then they take the research and they push it into their coaching systems and their federations, and they make sure everybody knows what actually works, as opposed to building your system based upon a Tiger Woods story or an Andre Agassi story or otherwise. And so, we got a long way to go, but I think that's.
There's no AAU biathlon. That helps too.
Yeah, right.
So in this room, I think all of us who are parents, we all want the same thing for our kids within sports, and that is for our kids to reach their potential as athletes, right? I mean, it's really, I think, that simple. The system we have now is not that system. If anything, it creates obstacles for our kids in pursuit of reaching their potential. 50% of reported youth sports injuries in the United States are the result of overuse. 50%. These are injuries that could be avoided if kids were playing 2 or 3 sports a year. When adults aren't closely managing sports for kids, kids don't get overuse injuries. When something hurts, they stop playing. But when adults are in charge, they tend to play through injuries, and that results in overuse, 50%. The other statistic that is a real indictment of our system is the percentage of kids who drop out by 13. By some estimates, 70% of kids are leaving organized sports by age 13. I mean, imagine if 70% of Walmart's customers walked out of the store and said, never going back there, nothing in there for me. Walmart would figure out a different way to do business the next day. They wouldn't be content with 70% of their customers walking away. But in youth sports, we seem very content with the status quo, even though the customers tell us this really isn't for me.
Do you guys have questions? I hope you do. Yeah, Bryce.
So do you think it's more of a hyper-competitiveness of youth sports, or is it like capitalistic kind of mindset on youth sports that's like the biggest issue right now?
Uh-oh, none of them are going for that question.
I mean, I don't think it's a cop-out to say it's really both. I mean, it's hard to separate out. I mean, maybe what's different now is the capitalistic, because I think, as Mark was saying, competitiveness is in our DNA. I just think there's and about the businesses out there because it's on your phone, it's on your Facebook feed. You know what your neighbor's kid is doing with travel sports because they're posting Instagram pictures about it and all this stuff. And so there's a natural keep up with the Joneses competitiveness to it too. And there's so many providers of the service. I grew up in New York, and there was 2 AAU basketball teams when I was growing up in the 90s. There were literally 2. Now there are 200. I mean, and all these teams can function because it's easy to, you don't need word of mouth. You just, you have Facebook and you can market yourself in your organization. So maybe I changed my answer a little bit. I think what's different now is the capitalism, maybe.
I would build on that and say there's actually it's important to think about what we mean by competition. I think actually kids want to compete. They really do. Even if you aren't keeping score, they've got the score in their head. That's okay. They actually love competition environments. You watch video games, it's constant competition. What's different is the emphasis on winning. So how adults approach competition versus kids approaching competition are two different things. Kids want to be in that moment. They want to test themselves. They might even cry after they lose the game if they really, really care about it. But literally 5 minutes later, they usually move on. They're done with it because it's all about testing yourself in that moment. It's the parent who ends up obsessing about whether they won or lost the game or whether they perform well in the game. It's the parent who keeps talking to them on the ride home, from the game and at the dinner table, and decides to go to Coach Up or whatever it is and hire a private trainer to fix that flaw in the swing that they saw yesterday. And so adults live in this world where we understand the consequences of winning and losing more than kids do. We're out here in a competitive environment. It's hard to get into an elite college, and when you get into a workplace, you want the good jobs, and 100 people apply for them, and only one person gets it. And there are consequences to winning and losing. So we approach it differently than kids do. Kids simply want a competitive environment, but they don't want to obsess. They don't want to feel the consequences of winning and losing. And you look at like video games. They'll try stuff. They'll lose the game. They move on. Literally, they're done with it after that. But they like that So how do we create sports structures that embrace competition and promote competition and winning and losing, but there isn't the heavy consequence? The feeling bad like you lost, or because you lost, you're now eliminated from a playing opportunity moving forward. I think that's our real challenge.
Well, it is funny that you say that because it seems like we straddle a very bizarre line. I remember my son was in a basketball league that he actually never played in because we went on a trip or whatever, but he got a trophy at the end. And we didn't even know these people, and there was a little engraved trophy. And everyone gets a trophy now. We're not happy if everybody doesn't get recognized for something, but yet we have this hyper-competitiveness that we have to make our kids be the best. So how does society function on both those spheres, together?
I have to say that the participation trophy controversy, to me, is one of the most overstated issues of our time. I've never met an adult who felt that they were in some way warped by receiving a participation trophy that they threw out the next day. I mean, it's a colossal waste of money, but was it James Harrison? There was an NFL player who just went bananas over his son receiving a participation trophy, and it became like a big deal for a month. Are youth sports being ruined by participation trophies? And I know that the trophy companies don't think that youth sports are being ruined by participation trophies, but so that's just an aside.
I agree. I think look, again, my son plays college soccer. You know how many trophies he received in the course of playing soccer since age 5? I think 2. A grand total of 2 trophies. So I don't think it's even a culture where kids are being loaded up with tons of trophies, much less participation trophies. It's sort of like it does happen if you go to these like travel tournaments constantly where they feel like they need to hand out rings and otherwise. But that, in theory, those are like meritocracy type of environments. So I don't get it. I think it's mostly. Honestly, I think the whole participation trophy thing it's a political discussion. It's a way for conservative commentators to complain about liberals and millennials. It's a proxy. It's a proxy for the real conversation around entitlement, young people and entitlement. Mm-hmm. I think that's a legitimate one, but it has nothing to do with participation trophies in youth sports.
And another thing that gets, I think, lost in the race for competition and with the travel and the AAU is the local community leagues and the schools teams. I mean, that's, besides the opportunity cost that you personally, might be giving up by doing high intensity youth sports, leaving behind the local little leagues and the school teams, that's a big deal. Playing little league or rec league, town soccer. I mean, you're with your community, you're with your neighbors, or if you're playing for your school, your teachers come to the games. It's a cool thing, and it's important for a kid to experience that if he or she can. You go to these AAU tournaments, it's each parent out for themselves a little bit, and that's a little, dangerous, I think, not to be too dramatic about it. I've noticed that, living this a little bit. And my son does play for his school, and there's a lot, and he does play Little League. I think there's, but those, in our town, our neighborhood, they had trouble getting enough kids to play Little League baseball at the 11, 12-year-old level. I mean, you lose, there's a parade, there's it's like the neighborhood ball, these kind of.
There's community.
There's community, and in a world where there's a lack of community because there's so much faceless communication.
Right.
There's not as much opportunity for face-to-face communication, and if that's going to be lost because you're going everywhere every weekend, I think that's something people got to think about.
And Sean's making such an important point there. I remember being at a conference with Mark Messier, the former NHL player, and he had a child who was 11 or 12, something like that. His child was playing in a rec league, and those of us at the conference were like, Mark Messier's kid is not playing travel. And he said, and I remember this vividly, it impressed me so. He said, I want my kid to play with less talented kids. I want my kid to play on a diverse team, socioeconomically and ethnically and everything else. Because ultimately, those lessons are far more important than stick handling.
Yeah.
And I think rec sports, we need a good marketing campaign for rec sports because they become so devalued. And I think in some ways, rec sports are really what youth sports should be all about in terms of values and lessons and really instilling in kids the things that they're going to take with them throughout their lives.
I mean, you could do both. I mean, there are ways for if you have balance, but there's so many parents that just that's not good enough. Little League stinks, and that's there's so many extremes.
And you know where they do both? College campuses. You have the NCAA teams, and then you have a robust intramurals arrangement.
And you have club in the middle of that.
And then you got club in the middle of that. I mean, if you're, I don't know exactly the intramurals environment here, but imagine it's pretty darn good. If you want to play sports, you can play. You play on your own terms. It's a great time. You drink beers afterward. You develop bonds. You become lifelong friends. Why can't we, and this is on a college by college basis, why can't we take these wonderful college environments, the sports structures that we have here, and bring them back down to the high school level and bring them back down to the community level? We know they work here. So how do we make that happen?
And this also speaks to the issue of access, right? So sports in your neighborhood are affordable for a lot more people than sports 200 miles away where you've got to stay in a Comfort Inn for 3 nights.
Right.
So why do we have to get in a plane and fly for 2 hours to do something that you could do down the street?
And it's counterproductive to skill development too, in a way, because when you're all that time in a plane or in the car, you're better off for most of the time as kids going to the park and working on your dribbling. So you're going all this way to play, maybe 2 or 3 travel games where you might not get the ball and you might not play that much. And instead of spending all weekend on the road, you're better if you spend an hour working on your dribbling and shooting or on your pitching or you go to a batting cage. Skill-wise, you're better off staying home. And now, in fairness, playing against competition, you have to balance it. But if you're doing it every weekend, I just wonder how much better you can be if you didn't do it every weekend. And I think basketball in particular is grappling with that. I know the NBA is starting to try to police, because the AAU, the basketball AAU scene, travel AAU scene has gotten so hyper-competitive that it might be affecting, there's plenty of good basketball players in America, but, the college game, I think you can argue, skill-wise, aesthetically, there's been a decline. And it's not just because a lot of good players are going to the pros. So I think, macro, as far as talent development, again, all the things we do that research and common sense say could be counterproductive, we do anyway.
Absolutely. Other question?
Do you think organized sports starts too young? And if you do, what age would you start?
Well, again, this is an example where there are actually pediatricians thinking about this and in a much more thoughtful way than this particular panel could. And before the age of like 3 or 4, there's not a lot of developmental value in organized youth sports. That's the thinking. But of course, entrepreneurs have gotten into this space. I've done a couple of stories on this that are pretty funny. I mean, you can buy a sports video for an infant. And there are companies that actually provide fitness training for infants. Don't ask me what they do exactly, but adults, we're that vulnerable to pitches with respect to very young children. But the medical advice is before 3 or 4, it's more for you than it is for the kid. Yeah.
I guess, like someone mentioned, your 5-year-old was playing soccer. Do you think they would have not gotten that scholarship if they started at 7 as opposed to 5? And I know it's on an individual basis, but from my experience being a basketball coach, these kids these days need to be told what to do, when to do it, where to go, instead of having a pickup game where, just go over to the right side of the court. They'll know what to do because they play pickup. However, these kids these days, they've got to go to a certain spot. You have to basically tell them, that's just an idea. You have to read the defense, for example. And they are just driven by, they have to know what to do, when to do it. I mean, we see it in college when kids text you because they have the ability to text. I mean, before they would call you once a week, but now they're texting you, what can I, what should I have for dinner? And they're just not making decisions on it. So I thought it would have been higher, to be honest.
Well, I think there's some sports that we've gotten into this model that you have to do it early. On our last panel, John Markle was talking about hockey, that you can't be a 14-year-old starting in hockey, or you can't even be an 8-year-old starting in hockey. You don't start at 5 or 6. That sport is closed to you, unless you're really an extraordinary person. And so, how do we kind of combat that model where we're now seeing that, the progression from T-ball to coach pitch, all of that is very linearly focused toward having an athlete that builds on skills from the age of 4 or 5. How do we combat that?
I think we were talking a little bit about it at lunch. If there's somehow it sounds silly to organize build free play. It's an oxymoron, but so that kids can, and the issue of kids wanting to hear, that's a national parenting issue of how much are we over the last 20 years, how much organized everybody's lives have been, and how parents now are, I think, a little more fearful of letting their kids do their own thing because, again, we know all the bad stories of bad things happening, even though the risks of that for the most part. So parents don't, they want to, I think these, we're kind of predisposed to organizing our kids' lives, and I think you just have to maybe just throw, as far as like athletic performance, just throw out evidence like the Australian Olympic team, free play and learning on your own can only help.
Yes.
My husband and I run a youth academy in the youth league for a sport called futsal. So I don't know if you've heard of it.
Futsal.
free play or unstructured play, and that's where everybody comes in, but we have to organize it to get them there. They won't text each other to meet up in the park and play freely. They won't go out and play with the neighborhood kids. They'll only come if we organize it, and they know that we're gonna be there. And even if we're late and they're already there, they won't start playing without us. Like, they won't start playing until we get there. And it doesn't have no price, no cost. So how do you relay that to people in America that this has value? Because we've been doing that for over a decade, and then we started doing like more organized academy style, travel style stuff that had a dollar value, and everybody wanted to do that, and nobody would show up for the free play. So it's crazy because the parents will see a value to it. They didn't have to pay for it. They don't have any status in it. They think that their kid's not learning anything there, but they're learning more than they would have when they come and we're in a gym and we're doing this, we're doing that, and then they get mad. They're like, oh, why aren't you doing this dribbling drill? Or why aren't you getting these touches? And they're like, well, your kid can do that in their driveway. They can do that like in their yard. Like, we're not here to make sure that you hit the ball back and forth between your feet 50 times. We're teaching you how to work with your teammates and, set pieces or offense, defense. Like, those little things come to free pickup and get creative. Like, we're just there just to be there. But you're there for the creativity and to build those relationships with your community. And it doesn't discriminate, and it's just, the mindset is crazy, but they just push away that unstructured play. It's nothing.
I mean, that seems thematic about rec sports in general, and we have someone from rec sports in the front row here. It's if I can pay for it, it's worth more. So if I can pay for travel, it's clearly worth more. I'm going to get a better coach. I'm going to get a better experience than if I do something with rec. So how do we break that mindset?
I mean, I think it's just, it's parent education. Ultimately, parents need to come to value free play, or in your case, loosely supervised play, right? There's organized play, there's free play, and then somewhere in between is loosely supervised, which is great. It's terrific you're doing that. And that really is the answer, because parents now, they won't let their kids hop on the bike, as I did when I was a kid, and ride a mile away and make up games in the park with someone else. I mean, that's considered bad parenting these days, because who knows what could happen to that child in that park, right? So I don't think we can say, let's bring back those days. I mean, and I think it's very important to remember, we're not trying to take youth sports back to some rosy era, because it really wasn't perfect back then either. Remember, girls didn't have great access to sports. Kids with disability didn't have great access to sports. So there was never any perfect time in our youth sport environment. The question is, how do we build a better model moving forward? And I think part of that is helping parents understand the value of free play and helping the child fall in love with the sport, take ownership of the sport, play for intrinsic reasons, talk to them about the value of that, and even developing elite athletes. Michael Jordan, very early on in his career, some of you may remember, had something called the love of the game clause built into his contract with the Chicago Bulls, which allowed him to play pickup basketball with whoever he wanted in certain kinds of environments, because they ordinarily would discourage it for injury reasons or otherwise. But he appreciated the value in having those environments where you could just try things and there were no consequences to it, and wasn't a training focused environment. So how do we build like a love of the game clause into kids sports? And have parents appreciate that. No, fine, you want your kid to become the best athlete possible. Well, you're going to carve out, you really should carve out free play opportunities. And you should be looking for coaches who promote that and promote love of game as opposed to just a training focused environment. I think that's part of it, is having parents appreciate, because it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, today you don't have colleges recruiting kids off the playground anymore. They're all coming out of clubs. They're all coming out of organized environments. So it's a hard thing for parents to get their mind around, that a playground environment, a free play environment, is actually productive. So I think that's key.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that point. I think we need to meet parents where they are. Parents are not going to stop dreaming for their kids. They're not. You tell them that 1% of high school athletes get scholarships to college. that's not going to dissuade them. We know that because it hasn't over a long period of time. They have to, and I definitely include myself, we need to start valuing things like free play, as Tom says, and those other components of becoming the best athlete we can be. I think the way we've defined that in recent times has been very narrowly, and in a way that has not done our kids any favors.
With futsal, maybe just start put up the Brazilian flag, because
Oh, I mean, we like.
You know,
we have
that-
videos, pictures, but we do. We bring flags. We bring like our stereo equipment, and we play like samba music, or like just like bring a whole different
Yeah.
cultural aspect to it.
just bring up how many World Cups has Brazil won, you know?
Well, we're like, hey, you know, our slogan is play how the rest of the world plays it through. Because we're doing this all over the world. You know, they don't have posh plots of grass or Grand Park, you know, in Westfield, Indiana. They're literally just going to play because they love it. It's in their blood. It's part of their culture. And that's something that like America's like missing out on, really, on a lot of sports, other than maybe like football or basketball. So we're trying to get a good balance of like, you need unstructured play with your friends, free play in the park, or just kicking it around with your parents, and then there's a good balance of structured play with your coaches or your school team, or, you know, whatever it might be.
Do you have a website?
Yeah, it's columbusfutsal.us.
I won't remember
I'll
that.
put it on our
Well,
website and I'll send it to you.
Thank
Ryan,
you.
you had a question?
So you guys kind of like touched on this, but college coaches like aren't going to rec sports teams like events to watch potential players. They're not even going to high school to watch potential players. They're going to the AAU games. They're going to the travel teams. They're going all those places that are more competitive. So I guess like how do you implement what you guys are talking about, these socioeconomical lessons and everything in that type of play, and also trying to compete to get these college scholarships?
I mean, I'll touch on that a little bit. Yeah, they're not going to at the college level, but does it have to start at the youth level? The college coaches aren't going to the seventh. I mean, in certain cases they are, but there's this kind of perception out there that a kid's going to get exposure and discovered when he or she is 10 and 11. Now, when it gets, the college recruiting scene, it's convenient for coaches to go to one place or, you know, a few showcases a year. That industry, the showcase industry at that level has developed. It's going to be hard to pare that back, I think. But I think it's gotten into our collective psyche that my kid's going to get discovered, he's going to get exposed, he or she's going to get exposure at a 12U, 11U tournament. Nobody cares. You know, the best 11-year-old, you know, is not going to be odds are not going to be the best 17-year-old. So I think, to your question, I don't know if that's going to change, but I think we can make changes on the younger level because the feeder system, it'll bring back some more rationality to everything, and I think it'll develop better players as well.
I would argue that the colleges and the NCAA can do a lot to fix this environment. I mean, even if they don't get rid of merit-based athletic scholarships, which is the whole incentive structure. But they have, I mean, how much credibility does Ohio State have in the state of Ohio? What if all the coaches for all the you know, teams here really understood and embraced, you know, the American development model concept of what athletic development looked like, and then messaged that out to all of the other coaches around the state, maybe held, you know, clinics during the summer, made them free, just really led the education on a state-by-state basis the dominant universities do. And then what about all the athletes cycling out of this college? I mean, how many NCAA level athletes are here?
1,024.
1,024. So every year, 400 or so athletes cycle out of this university and go back into their communities. Now, a few might go to the NFL or the NBA. Most of them are going to go back to their communities. Why can't we, at the end of each year, get every one of those athletes, give them a 1-week training course on how to be an effective youth coach? You know, they already know the skills and tactics in their sport. Give them the key competencies in working with kids. Psychologically, what can they handle? What's age appropriate? Give them the safety training. Give them CPR, first aid, concussion management. Help them set up, know how to set up a local program in Cleveland or Cincinnati or wherever else it may be. So when they go back in the community, they can be these real assets and these emissaries for proper athletic development. And because they were a former Buckeye, people are going to listen to them. They've got extreme credibility, and they can trump that guy down the street who didn't play at this level and doesn't have that kind of credibility. So, I think this is what universities, I don't think it's just an opportunity. I think it's a responsibility that they have, since they are the chief beneficiaries of this whole sport system that we've created.
That kind of segues something that I kind of skirt around it through this whole discussion, but the relationship of academics and athletics in our country, I think it's fairly unique in the world, especially in lower levels. So on the one hand, it seems like we're beginning to pursue a more European model of clubs and kind of taking it out, and yet at the same time acknowledging the place that it has. Certainly universities like this, where sports give back a great deal and create community and some of those kinds of things. So what direction do you see that relationship having, particularly at a high school level, where high school soccer teams, basketball teams are really beginning to suffer the consequences of their best athletes not being part of their community? To me, that seems to be the real immediate crisis that seems to be really close to happening.
I'll turn to look at you, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to answer my own question, I guess. And maybe it will intersect with yours. But to me, our focus as a society should be on encouraging participation throughout your life. That's one of the values that I think is so important with respect to youth sports. And rather than looking at youth sports as I said, a career path and a stepping stone to a college scholarship or a professional career. And I think what we have is more focused on that latter model. And we know that there are very few kids who are going to achieve those ends. So I'm not sure that I've answered your question, but for me, that's the goal. And I think we've got a long way to go to achieve that. So I'll defer.
There's a lot of irony in that this is happening at the same time that physical education requirements are declining in education systems, where our kids are less likely to have PE and kind of experience a lot of those physical education opportunities because they have to, because of the education requirement, and the elite athlete is kind of dominating the facade of, so you're kind of caught at the crossroads. If you're not in that camp, you're not going to be encouraged to really be active at all, and that seems to be hastening rather than easing back.
And that's where the economic split kind of comes in. One stat is if families that make $100,000 or more, households, 41% of those kids participate in team sports. If it's less than 25, that number goes down to 19%. So you're right, the elite athletes are getting, they have access to those sports as long as they can afford it. And then the kids who aren't at the elite level and just need to stay in shape, just need physical activity when PE is being cut and those kind of things. And the other sport access is going up market. How many people are left behind?
I'd say school-based sports are something of a crossroads right now, and the whole concept that was developed about 120, 130 years ago in this country. And it still works really well in certain kind of schools. You look at the prep schools, you look at some of the smaller schools that have sports, not the charters, which often don't. And it works. Most kids play sports. Sometimes it's even co-curricular. You're required to play a sport. If 60 kids come out for the soccer team, they'll create 3-4 teams. Where the school-based model struggles these days is often with the large, often urban schools where 80 kids will come out for the basketball team, 15 will make it, 8 will get, 8 will get playing time. So the supply of opportunities is not meeting the demand for opportunities. And there are not intramurals, and PE has been diminished to 1 day a week or whatever else it may be. So I think as we move forward here, and Dave Ridpath is in the room here. Dave, where are you? Raise your hand here. Dave has written a whole book on this thing. If you guys want to actually think in a progressive way about what's next, please get Dave's book. He has, he worked 3 years on this. He went to Germany. He looked at the European model. He's done more deep thinking about the school-based model than really anyone in this country. And this is a terrific book that will spark a lot of conversations. How's that for an endorsement, Dave?
What's the name? What's the name of the book?
Tom wrote the foreword. It's called Alternative Models of Sport Development in America.
Yes.
And it's available at the bookstore here, over Barnes & Noble.
It's a Barnes & Noble. Everybody should read this. And anyone who cares about this in this space, I'll stop selling. But I believe in it. Obviously enough that I wrote the foreword. But I think schools are going to have to ask themselves, why do we have sports? Is it just to elevate opportunities for the small percentage of the kids in the school who are the elite athletes, who probably had access to clubs and therefore the money to play in these clubs as we got through? Or if we know the scientific research showing that being physically active produces better cognitive outcomes, better educational outcomes, better academic outcomes, should we use our limited dollars to invest in all kids? Does that mean bringing back intramurals if we have the facilities? Does that mean sort of redesigning? Does it mean using the available spaces in more efficient ways? Does it mean redesigning the role of PE teachers to be, instead of the providers of sport opportunities, but they become something of a community connector? They're the ones who know all the programs in the community, which ones are abiding best practices, and then make sure the kids and their parents know about those programs and they work with those programs. Bring them in, do some sports sampling. If a school can't provide those opportunities, how can they work more effectively with community providers? I would argue that schools, especially public schools where we're all paying into them, have an obligation to every kid in the student body and not just the kids who, have some potential to play D1 to D3 sports.
But I also think that we as adults and parents have a responsibility to value participation. We value excellence in sports, but as the adults in the room, we also need to convey to our kids that participation matters too. Participation in youth sports, one of the reasons it falls off at 12 and 13 is because parents, when they see that their kids are not going to be the star athlete and maybe won't be playing for a varsity team in high school, the parents begin to lose interest in being volunteer coaches and supporting their kids. And why should a kid who is not on that track to be a varsity athlete stop playing competitive sports? There really is no reason other than that the opportunities are kind of disappearing for those kids. So I think it's a societal issue. It's an attitude.
I want to play devil's advocate just for 1 second. ESPN has the Wide World of Sports complex, which opened about 10 years ago. And it collects tournament fees, hotel stays, theme park tickets for 385,285 athletes in 2016. Now, let's say I know my kid's not going to go to the bigs. I know my kid's not going to play Division I or even play Division III college athletics. The most my kid's ever going to do is play somewhere between the age of 12 and 16. Why wouldn't I take him to some incredibly pageantous environment, to the Cal Ripken Field? Or, I know that we had the opportunity in Little League to go to where they play the Little League Worlds, or to go to Cooperstown and play on that field for a fee. But it gave us the opportunity. We didn't do it because I was too cheap. But it gave us the opportunity to have this experience. Why wouldn't we do that if we want to give our kids the best, or at least the best experience that they might have?
I think that's a really important point. We criticize it, but it definitely has its rewards when done, I think, with the proper perspective. And for a lot of kids, if you're a parent and you know that this might be my kid's only chance to be in the big time. And, you know, it's fun. It could be fun. Kids can make friends. The hotel pool and experience of bonding with the other parents, there's nothing wrong with that. And if the kid wants to do it, it's hard to say, no, you're not going to go to Disney World. But so I think that's the kind of, and I alluded to, that's kind of the weird travel sports paradox, is that it's almost better for kids who aren't going to make it, because that's their one opportunity at the big time. If I know my kids, if I want my kid to be a Division I athlete, again, I think you're better off working on your skills during that time than sitting around a hotel and playing one game a day. So it's a weird kind of thing, and I think it is important to acknowledge that it's not all bad. I mean, you lived it, right? I mean, but the sad part about it is it depends on your financial resources.
Yeah,
and
I
that's
mean,
the sad part.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge why this travel team culture has emerged, and that's one of the factors. It could be good. You get time in the car. I mean, you ask, why would you drive 3 states away? One of the reasons is I get time. I get sick 5 hours in the car
It's the
with
only
my
time
kid,
he talks to me
and
now.
we actually have a conversation, and that's good. And I know he's around a generally good group of kids, and he's engaged in positive activity. So there are definitely benefits to it. The trouble with it is that you go into it, you need to know exactly why you're doing this. You're doing it for those reasons. You're getting time with your kids, as opposed to, ooh, this is going to help them get the college scholarship, or this is going to help them. We need to strip all the mythology and all the misinformation from it and let the economy then take care of itself. And if you're going for those reasons, 2 thumbs up. It's okay. But right now, this is where we get these eruptions in sports, the crazy parents and the pressure on the kids and otherwise, is because they're not really tuned into actually the needs of the kid, but they're thinking about the downstream ROI.
I think context is important, right? So, and I think that's what Sean and Tom are saying. As a general rule, I think the more financially invested we become in our kids' sports lives, the more emotionally invested we become. And you need to be alert to that. And, I've written about parents who've traveled thousands of miles to a tournament. Their kid goes 0 for 2 in the first game and doesn't play for 3 days. Now the parent is upset because they've made this investment in time and money, and the child isn't delivering on some expectation of the parent. So,
Or the coach.
Or the coach.
You know?
So there are dynamics that you need to be alert to, and as Tom says, you need to give some thought, I think, to why am I doing this? Why is this important to me?
We had a question. I'm sorry, right here we had a
Yeah,
question.
is this a problem that's unique to sports, or is there really something more broadly going on here? I mean, I've got a daughter who's I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but she was a ballerina. She danced 6 days a week. It was 3 hours plus per day, and it wasn't us necessarily pushing, but she felt she had to be doing it in the ballet world. The neighbor across the street has 2 kids who play piano, and they play piano till their fingers bleed, I suspect, because I hear it at all hours of the day. And I've got another neighbor who sends his kid to supplemental math classes, and they do math till the cows come home. I mean, it's in just math, and because the more they do, the better they're going to be, and certainly in the short run, I think this is probably also true in youth sports. In the short run, they're better, right? The kid who plays 100 hours a year is going to be better, all other things being equal, than the kid who plays 20 hours a year, 50 hours a year. So isn't this much broader, and is there research like what you all have been writing about and talking about, which is so compelling, that is this focus only on sports at this point, or is this something much broader going on in society?
These are parenting issues. They're not unique to sports, and I think you put your finger on it. There are a number of excellent books that take a broader view of the issues we're talking about. If you'd like some recommendations, I'd be happy to give them to you after the panel.
It's escape, if I can just add just one, there was an NBA player named, whose name, I think is Bigelow, does that sound right?
Bob,
Yeah, Bob
Bob
Bigelow.
Bigelow, yeah.
And he came to speak, I'm from Westchester County, New York, and, Rye and Scarsdale and Larchmont, and these, they're full of the kids that you're talking about, right? They have too much money and they're hyper competitive, and Bob was saying all the things that you're saying. And a mom stood up and said, yeah, but if we scale back and put our kids in rec, what's Scarsdale going to do? and there was silence in the room because everybody was sort of nodding their heads. Yeah, that's right. If Rye doesn't do it, then Scarsdale is going to dominate Westchester County, and it's a parent issue. It just feels like there's so much economics pushing us in the direction, so many economic interests pushing us in the direction you're talking about. And who's really to advocate for the kids if the parents are on board or so influenced by these economic interests? It's just
Yeah, it's an issue of competitive parenting on some level, right? You want your kid to get out ahead, but you also don't want your kid to be left behind. I mean, I let my son play travel soccer in 3rd grade, not because we were like super motivated to get onto the travel team thing and do 3 seasons of sports when, he's 8, 7 years old or whatever it was. But I didn't want him to miss out on an opportunity because you looked at the high school team and all those kids played not just travel but club. So it was actually a conservative impulse, the desire to preserve an opportunity as opposed to accrue an advantage that caused me to do that. So I think that's where it comes down to leadership. Sport organizations at the national level and at the local level need to create structures where parents don't feel those kinds of pressures. And that means investing in town rec leagues that have good coaches. You actually get them trained so you don't feel like, if you keep your kid in rec that it's gonna be hopeless, I think that's what's it's gonna take leadership, and I think it's gonna take towns coming together, and saying to themselves, get the baseball people and the soccer people in the room, and the school and the PE teacher and the town rec board folks and whoever the mayor's office, and say, okay, what kind of sport environment do we want to have in this town? How do we not put pressure on all of each other that ultimately causes problems for our kids? All right, well, great. If that's the vision we want to create, now how do we develop policies? Are you going to agree to hold off on the travel team to this age? Are you going to hold off? Okay, now how are we going to make sure that kids can play multiple sports? Will you back off in this season? Okay, I'll back off at the end of my season. Will you promote my league? Sign up some my league? Yeah, sure, I'll do that for you as well. I mean, it's going to take that kind of community conversation around what kind of sport environment they want to have, and then I think you're going to release some of those pressures. We're literally trying to create such a toolkit right now within Project Play.
And there are little things that can be done. Simply, for instance, here's an idea. Every youth sports board, I think, should have on it a parent whose child graduated from the league 10 years ago. The parent has been through the cycle, made all the mistakes, or many of them, and is in a position, has less testosterone, if it's a man, to speak with some conviction and authority to members of the board whose kids are in the league now and are seeing things differently. I think that kind of perspective, we lose all of that wisdom because everything that you've learned during that 10 to 12 year cycle when you were making all of the mistakes and caught up in the excitement, once your kid is out of the league, all of that wisdom is lost to the parents who are just starting. I think there ought to be a way to capture that.
You have a question?
Do you think that we need to change our goal of sports as more being physically active as opposed to the scholarship? Do you think that would help? I mean, there's gobs of research on physical activity and free play and all that stuff, but the benefits of physical activity have been so well documented. If we're able to shift our focus to the participation is the goal, you're exercising for the purpose of exercising, I think that would help society kind of shift their focus away from the winning and the
Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, you have to, that's the first conversation needs to happen at the community level is what are the core values? Why are we doing sports here? Is it to see if we can get one or two kids who can play at Ohio State? Or is it to provide, quality of life for, and habits of health and fitness for, every kid in this community? I think even sports crazy communities will come down on the ladder, right? They're not having that conversation right now. So if you define your core value as health, and there's great research to support the idea that kids whose bodies are in motion or playing sports when served well are going to benefit from it, then you can begin to design your policies and your structures and your programs in a manner that ties back to that core value. But we're not having core value conversations right now. We're just, it's anybody's doing anything they want to do, and we end up with this dysfunctional system that we have.
Yeah, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like you're advocating a huge cultural sea change. Because in this country, if you're not number one, you're essentially a loser. You know, and I think that's part of our imperative culture. Are you saying, like for example, you're a new teacher, you're going in front of the school board, you're going to say, I'm not all about winning, I'm just getting everybody to play. Now that's what I'm hearing from you. And I'm thinking, is that even possible? As ingrained as we are being competitive?
Yes, I think it is, because that was the original concept of sports in this country. When we designed it 120 years ago, when physical education was introduced to the schools, it wasn't just to train up the best kids in the community. When the playground movement between 1900 and 1920, there were 2,000 urban parks built in New York and Chicago and Boston. That wasn't just for the best athletes, that was for the broad-based population. When school sports were first conceived, it wasn't just about the very, very best kids in the school. It was about giving everybody a playing opportunity. Over time, it became much more elite focused. And, again, the chase for the scholarship and all the pro money that we see out there, it's sort of warped our system. But I think our core values, if we really have this conversation, are where they were 120 years ago. And I think there's evidence to suggest that that's not even an outdated model. You can, again, look at Norway. Norway committed to a sport for all concept, fitness, play. They even like their participation trophies over there. It's not the core of their system, but they produce the most competitive athletes in the world. And yet it's development focused, and it's a model of inclusion at the base. So if we really want to be number one in the world, and if we really want to produce the very best athletes, it's not doing it the way we're doing it right now. It's buying into a model that really we helped pioneer 120 years ago, but we just lost our way.
I see it as kind of a two-part analysis. Part one is the message, and I think Tom spoke to that. We're not going to get parents to abandon this idea that their kids are going to be playing center field for the Indians. That will always be the case. We ought not to try to change that. So the message then becomes, this is the path. This is your best opportunity. Sports sampling, taking a step back from very intensive training, et cetera. I think that's the message. And then another key aspect, I think, is the messenger. Who are the messengers going to be? And Tom and I spent some time thinking about this. Professional sports franchises, I think, have a big role to play. Who are the thought leaders and the influencers in our society who have benefited from this approach to get to the top of the pyramid? They ought to be, among those who are out front communicating that message to parents who are impressionable and more likely to listen to them than to us.
And one, I think Nicole mentioned earlier, was Christian Pulisic in soccer. I mean, he's America's best soccer player, and they purposely said no travel, developed with his playing locally, developed with his dad, was kind of helped him coach, and when it was time to really develop his skills, he went to Germany. But so guys like that, women like that who are at the top of their fields. I mean, those are going to be, just to your point, the kids are so much more likely to listen to the stars than to their parents.
Well, and, I mean, speaking of who they listen to, I was intrigued, Tom, by the 2014 study that ESPNW did with the Aspen Institute, and I found it really interesting. It was ESPNW that did it. And it showed that parents continue to see youth sports as a valuable institution. More than 8 in 10 said they'd still allow their child to join a team, but mentioned specifically that it's all about moms, that if moms start to push back, that we're going to start to see some change. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your thoughts on the involvement of kind of the nurturing mother figure that we have.
Yeah, and Mark knows this really well, too, because he's done such great work on football. And who's the gatekeeper for football? Well, it's often the mom, right? Yeah, moms are the change makers. If we can, they're fierce. I mean, they will do what's right for their kids. They'll prioritize it above anything else. And if they believe something is the right way to go, they're a force to be reckoned with. They're still a little bit lost. I mean, we need to give them good information. We need to empower them to make, good decisions for their children and to demand quality from local programs. And if we can do that on more of a mass scale, I think they're the game changers. They're arguably, the key stakeholder right now. Look, the NFL recognizes it. Moms are not wanting to put their kids in tackle football anymore. So the NFL has a very focused campaign on how to talk to moms and get them comfortable with their kids wearing helmets and banging heads hundreds of times a year at age 6. So, and moms aren't buying it generally. So I think Mark, anything to add there?
Well, I think it's important for moms to be present as coaches in youth sports, and we need many more women. There are challenges for women. It's not a culture that is always welcoming to moms as coaches. That needs to happen. At the college level, the percentage of women's teams that are coached by women, in 1972, the year that Title IX was enacted, 90% of women's teams were coached by women. Today, it's under 40%. Because now men want to be coaches of women's teams. But it's symptomatic of a problem we have in women stepping forward or being given the opportunity to step forward as authority figures and leaders in youth sports. That's very important.
Other questions? Dave.
Yeah, Nicole, and this is for everyone. I know, Tom, you and I have talked a lot about a national sports policy. We're one of the few countries, that's maybe the only country, that doesn't have a national sports policy or national sports ministry to try to enforce this change. But I think if we talk about trying to be number one in the world, as we always want to be in America, one thing that we're not number one at, and we're far from being close to number one, is public health, right? And healthcare. And the lack of access, I would argue, and I argue in my book, is that he says that access to sports in European countries specifically, but for everybody. Because I wouldn't say their diet is any better than ours. In fact, I'd say in many ways it's worse, right? But having that access gives them the opportunity to be healthier, and I think we would all, certainly in this room, agree with that. So if we really want to be number one in something, right, why wouldn't we want to create a system where everybody can actually be healthier? We can lower healthcare costs. Tom's familiar with the study. Johns Hopkins says, I believe, Thomas, that kids are active 30 more minutes per week. It's billions over 30 years, billions, if not close to $1 trillion in healthcare costs. We're all struggling as a country here with the fact that we don't have PE classes, we don't have that access to physical activity. So that could be, I think, part of the changing. Bringing in mothers and others to say, look, it's not just about elite development. We can have that. That space will be there, but we need to have access for everybody, and that's where I think the conversation needs to be too.
Well, it's funny because we've almost gone the opposite direction where now I've met more kids that have gotten their ACLs repaired than I ever imagined I would in my life. And 10 years ago, I did a story about like major injuries of kids who were in athletics, and it was an anomaly. And now, you wrote, Mark, about kids getting Tommy John surgery or parents even wanting it to tighten their arms up before they pitch. So it almost feels, Dave, that we've gone, not only are we not caring about their health in the purest sense, but we're willing to compromise their health because medicine can fix it. So how do we reconcile all of those things? Mark, fix this for us.
I've tried. I can't. Access is an issue that we really haven't talked about very much on this panel, Dave, but I think it's critically important. Maybe we should have begun there. 50% of African American girls at age 17 do not exercise in a typical week. 50%. So, and access to organized sports in urban communities is horrible. I worked on a consulting project for Aspen closely with Tom, and this was the great challenge, one of the great challenges that we looked at. How do you bring sports opportunity closer to where kids live, particularly in urban settings? You know, these kids don't have transportation. How can we keep them in their communities, or at least provide that experience near where they live? So we're lowering the barriers to participation, and we came up with, I think, a pretty interesting list, but it's a tremendous challenge. And there are just many kids who are not part of the conversation that we're having today.
Do you think, Mark, if we could, whatever the message would be, that people understood that the savings to this country, if we want to just talk about it from a money perspective, for all of us, life expectancy, everything, you know, the fact that it would help out our inner cities, anything like that, do you think that we can get that message out to say, it would be a generational change, but to say, with your kids 30 years from now, it's going to be a better country. It's a small piece of what we need to do, right? But it can definitely help. And if you participate in organized sports, you're a better employee, right? You're a better citizen. All these other things. Can we get that message out?
Well, I think enlightened self-interest is always a great strategy. You know, this is good for someone else, but guess what? It's also good for you. I do think there's promise in that. You know, it also applies to the kids who are dropping out at age 11, 12, and 13. Those kids have access in the sense that they could sign up for leagues or have, but they're missing out on, you know, the lessons, classic sports lessons, perseverance, teamwork, taking instruction from a coach, all of those things that are attainable through sport to every kid on the team. You don't have to be the star player on the team to benefit in those ways from sport. And when kids drop out at 10 or 11 and 12, they're not present to benefit in those ways. So those are some of my thoughts.
One policy that's been floated by some nonprofit groups that just hasn't got much traction in Congress is basically savings accounts for youth sports, tax-free savings accounts that you can use towards healthcare expenses, setting aside some money pre-tax that you can spend towards physical activity, essentially. So use that money for joining the local Y, the community pool, stuff like that. You know, it could make a dent because, David, you hit it on the head. The numbers, the Johns Hopkins numbers are staggering. You know, a little bit more exercise can save this many billions in healthcare costs. But that, you know, there's a lot of competing public policies out there. But that policy, I don't think, has gotten much traction in D.C. to this point.
I think we need to, the healthcare industry has to care about those numbers for them to really matter. In my mind, the healthcare industry has completely failed in this space. They do not see sports, as the European countries do, as an asset in promoting public health. You know, we've had researchers tell us that if you turn in a grant application to the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and it has the word sports in it, you have no chance. Sport is seen, unfortunately, in this country as a subset of the entertainment industry. And the health industry, they hold these big conferences about how we're going to promote better health and otherwise, and it's, you know, there's very little conversation around preventive care, and there's zero conversation around the role that sports plays, which is the biggest chunk of physical activity in this country. So I think it's been a real failure from the government side to recognize the potential of sports playing a role, from the foundations that care about health just haven't done enough. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has done, supported some of our work. It's not central to what they're doing. The health insurers have largely abdicated. So making the health argument means that they're going to have to get hip to the opportunity that they have if they can create the conditions to have every child have the opportunity to play sports in a quality manner and in a way that produces positive health outcomes for life. It's a huge miss in our system, and I hope over time more of those key institutions will decide to care.
Yeah, I always argue, Tom, that the reason why the European healthcare system is better is because they're more proactive. We're reactive. And I don't know, maybe Mark can comment on this, but you would think the healthcare companies are economically, they benefit from this, right?
There's no way I'm touching that.
Well, I want to bring up another statistic that I thought was incredibly interesting, that 40% of baseball players in a study said it was okay for a coach to get thrown out to rile up his team. And there was a multitude of other stats of how it's okay for really what we would have considered to be inappropriate behavior. And as a hobby, I score hockey games. And I did a 3-on-3 pond hockey game the other day where a kid was going to shoot a penalty shot and the buzzer was going to go off, so I stopped the clock, even though it's a no stop. And the coach and the other players and the parents freaked out, like screaming, cursing, called me every name you could imagine because I stopped the clock with a second to go so this kid could shoot a penalty shot without the buzzer going off. Now, it feels like that we're not just compromising health and we're not just compromising economics, that we're really compromising morals and ethics to a certain degree when we put so much emphasis on winning, we put so much emphasis on performing, we put so much emphasis treating kids like they're professionals allows us or allows the public to treat them like they're professionals. We certainly see that here at Ohio State where I value my students and I cringe when I hear what the ones that are athletes, how they're screamed at on the field. But we have professionalized our kids to such a degree that behavior from parents prevents, we don't get officials anymore because nobody wants to be subjected to that abuse. How do we this seems to be such a vicious cycle that I don't know where to start first.
Well, this goes back to a point that I made at the beginning, which is that we've kind of conflated youth sports and professional sports. That to the extent that there was a chasm between the two, that we treated them differently, that difference is eroding. Now we see youth sports on TV all the time. It seems like an extension of professional sports. So in that sense, it's not surprising that the standards and the examples that we see in the professional arena now seem acceptable with respect to youth sports. Kids, they're emulating what they see on TV, and if they're on TV 100 times in the month of August, then really what's the difference between what the pros are doing and what they're doing? I think that's degraded the sports experience in my mind, the failure to maintain the distinction between what kids are doing and what professional athletes are doing.
And now it's blended into public policy on the local level. We haven't really touched on the facilities arms race in youth sports. I think somebody mentioned Grant Park in Indiana, Westfield, right, up near Indianapolis. I mean, $20 million in bonds to build this huge youth sports complex in the hopes that it'll spur local economic development. Now that sports as an economic development tool on the professional level, there's tons of research. It doesn't work. It does not work. But towns across the country are thinking, are banking on the youth tournaments because they bring in mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, siblings, and the economic multiplier effects can be substantial, and the towns are betting on that. So now we're going to have a situation where everyone's overbuilding, so there's going to be a glut of facilities. There's going to be a bubble at some point, and there's going to be white elephants on towns across the country.
And there's not only a bubble, but there's a demographic wave that's going to impact here. If you noticed, Toys R Us went out of business a few weeks ago. This is there was a baby boom in 2008, it peaked. There were just like largest number of kids ever born. So those kids, if you're born in 2008, you're entering youth sports in, 2014. We're now in 2018. And that, because of the recession in part, the number of births is going down, down, down. So there'd actually be fewer kids cycling into the system in the coming years, but you've got more and more of these facilities. And so it's a bit of a bubble economy. And at some point, frankly, too, if parents actually understand how hard it is to get the college scholarship and that there's not actually any real money unless it's football or basketball at the back end of the thing, I wonder if I can see a pullback. I mean, it's God bless these communities that are spending this kind of money, but I got to wonder if it's a wise investment.
We have a high school here that they spend $36 million on an athletic complex. When I toured with my son, the highlight of one private school here was their football workout facility mimicked Ohio State's, and that was the coup de grace sales point of their pitch. So, even in the academic sphere, we're competing in that way. What's that going to do to us academically when the school that I'm mentioning that's $36 million in athletic fields or athletic complex, their test scores are not among the highest in the city, let's just say.
And yet, we love youth sports. That's why we're all here. We spent the better part of 2 hours discussing problems and concerns. But the bottom line is that none of us can imagine life as a child without sports. And, occasionally it's worth reminding ourselves of that we really love this thing, and we
So
love
do
it
our
so
kids.
much that we want, that's what it's all about, preserving what's good about it and presenting this opportunity to as many kids as possible.
Do we have other questions? Yeah, Chris.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about, your ideas of mechanisms or recommendations for the Play for Life idea. I know, we've heard about avoiding burnout, and, Dave mentioned some idea of making sports more accessible for people. And, some of this plays into youth sports explicitly, and others outside of that. Mark talked about the backlash against participation trophies. Maybe we should be giving participation trophies to adults, or at least metaphorical.
They do. It's called your weekly paycheck. Whether you did a good job that week or not, you still get your paycheck.
So for building a culture of health, for building sports opportunities in midlife and beyond, what can we do at the youth level and moving through the life course?
I mean, we convene roundtables for 2 years, 10 roundtables, 300 leaders, and just listen for 2 years to figure out that question. And we took those ideas and then shrunk them down into this document, which both of my colleagues here are familiar with, called Sport for All, Play for Life, a playbook to get every kid in the game. And it's 8 strategies for the 8 sectors that touch the lives of children. None of them are rocket science. All of them are stolen ideas, but they're packaged in a manner that is a coherent set of strategies based upon a vision of an America in which all children have the opportunity to be active through sports. So I would encourage you to read that. I mean, but they're very simply worded ideas. Ask kids what they want so you can bring their voice into the design of experiences. Bring back free play, revitalize in-town leagues. Let me turn my phone off here. Sorry. Emphasize prevention. To give parents the confidence that if they put their kid into sport, they're not going to end up with head injuries. They're going to impair them for life. Train all coaches. Design for development, which means making sport age appropriate. So there is a framework, and there are a lot of organizations that are starting to move against it. I hope nobody comes out of this conversation here today just depressed and cynical and sad. I hope you come out of this motivated. There's a way out of this, and there are frameworks, and that framework can be applied wherever you live. It's a matter of kind of taking a look at it and saying, okay, how do I get this conversation started in my hometown? And how do we get sports right, make it accessible to every kid, and make sure it's a high quality experience? It can be done.
And that's when you hook them, right? If in-town leagues are revitalized, and it's a good experience for kids. You talk to them, and they're getting what they want out of it. Then they want to play for life, right? They're not burning out. And so when they're 30, 40, they're still playing soccer with their friends. That's when, from a marketing point of view, there's so many, like the sporting goods industry has a huge incentive to make it a good experience for kids. So many people within the industry, healthcare, the businesses, there's so many economic incentives. So a lot of incentives are aligned. Usually, in a lot of these things, there's all these conflicting actors. Play for life, I think just making it a good experience for kids you don't have to do PSAs to tell 40-year-old people to get active. Oh, that's helpful. You'll have a whole generation of kids who want to be active.
Well, something that Mark said that really resonated with me is kind of the perspective of time. And it seems like we're involved in athletics, in kids' athletics, when we have kids. But once we don't have kids, then we're not, And the people who are, it's almost like, why are they still doing this? Like, they don't have any kids in this. And maybe that's where we really need to foster participation and engagement, is those of us who have had perspective and have gone through this and realized the benefits and the challenges we faced. And if we could somehow take the time and become those people that advocate for change in our own communities, I think that voice may be among the loudest because of the perspective that you can bring.
So my son, I have two sons. The oldest.
You going to tell the story?
I wasn't planning to.
Oh, come on.
My oldest son is 30 now, and about 5 years ago he said to me, I'm going to coach this year in the rec league that he played in and I coached in. Would you be interested in being my assistant coach? So now I'm the assistant coach for my adult son, and I've never had a more enjoyable season in youth sports than that one.
You're in charge of yelling at the refs, right?
I carried the
That's your
equipment bag.
Fill up the water bottles.
I made sure that the on-deck batter knew that he was on deck and that he had a helmet on. I had, virtually no responsibility, which was perfect. But I can't really articulate why that was so much fun, but it just felt like I was coming full circle in some inexplicable way. So there's just so much to be gained from being engaged in youth sports when your kids are no longer playing in youth sports.
Yes. No, go ahead.
I was going to follow up on that. Is there much of an effort to engage my generation who's been through the ranks, is coming into more time, would love to impart some of that, and hopefully still has the energy, to impart some of this learning, to their kids who are now starting to go through the same things we went through, but we'd love to be good grandparents and help correct this situation. Is there any of this that you're doing aimed at this sort of baby boom generation?
I'll tell you, it's a great idea, and I'm going to throw the question back to you in a minute on how to do that exactly. But, I spoke yesterday in Maryland to a group of 125 people, all of whom were grandparent age, and they were really motivated about this topic. I don't know if it's because they look at their grandkids' lives and say, that's crazy what's going on, or whatever it is, but I was afraid that nobody was going to care in the room about this, but they actually really did. And I haven't fully thought through it. So let me ask you, if we were to recruit or, engage your generation, how exactly to do that? Is that to work with the AARP on a messaging campaign? Listen, I'm old enough to be member of AARP. That's not, but is there? How to do that exactly? What would hook you?
Probably not Facebook.
Not Facebook. Yeah.
Not today, anyway.
Yeah.
Just a little bit of structure through, I don't know, wise churches, organizations that, maybe, local golf clubs, get, people who are spending their time in other ways to be aware of of opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's a lot of energy there. You don't have to provide a lot of structure, just something to get people started. And then a sense that it's okay here. You don't, it's a lot of parents who are coaching their own kids. And so they're sort of trusted because they're part of the family and the kid community. When an older person comes in, maybe your grandparents,
Yeah, I love this.
Yeah, there's a role, I think, in mentoring kids, of course, but also mentoring the younger
Okay.
adults who are running the league and who may not see the long game as clearly as a parent who's been through it.
You got a question over here?
Yeah, I'd like to bring it back to participation, school sports, public policy, and in particular, a public policy that is now, I think, growing across this country rapidly because of our underfunding of public education, and that is there are now thousands of school districts that are charging middle school and high school kids to pay to participate. You know, here in Central Ohio, the rates generally run from $200 to about $550 per sport per child, and for some families that quickly becomes cost prohibitive. But this is now a trend that is going national, and I guess at one level I would urge the three of you to look into it and to use your platforms that you have to comment and opine on that. Any reactions you have to that? I'm not familiar with too much national literature on that. That's been a big problem in Ohio because Ohio is one of the first states to allow schools to charge parents for pay to play. But it's getting very expensive in lots of school districts around the country.
It's an access issue.
Right. And it certainly diminishes participation.
So if you were going to leave us all, because we're just about out of time, with one charge, with one, we had a great idea here about engaging in people who've been through the wars and get them back in the battle here. But if you could leave them with one kind of charge to move forward, to try to move this in a positive direction, what would it be, Sean?
I'm going to steal from Mark a little bit, and just the awareness. You think you said context. Parents just have to be aware of what the outcomes what they want them to be. Is the experience for your son or daughter? Is it if it's you want to work on skill development, do it in a way that's going to work and be a positive experience for the child. So I don't know. It's an attitude adjustment. It's a cultural adjustment. But as Tom said, all this is possible, and even Joey Baseball, who we kind of laugh at a little bit.
Much admired,
But to their credit, this is a father whose son travels all over the country playing baseball. He's lucky enough to afford it, but he has some perspective. It seems the kid likes the sport. He knows this might be his only chance to play "quote unquote" big time baseball, and so it's hard to criticize a guy for doing that. So it's just really, parents knowing why they're doing it and living in the moment a little bit. I mean, this is all Johnny or Jane's going to have. That's fine.
I would say we've created resources for this on our Project Play website, projectplay.us. They're all free. So I would say two things. One, take a look at our Project Play parent checklist. 10 simple checklists, 10 simple questions you can ask yourself, your child, and your local sport provider that will help you design a better experience for your kids. Take that, send it around to as many of your friends as possible. We're not making any money off of this. Again, this is free. Target underwrote it for us, but they don't even care to have their logo on there necessarily. We just think it's a great resource, a really, really simple resource that distills everything that Project Play is to a parent-type audience. So that'd be number one thing, is make yourself a smarter sport parent. The second thing is, I would say, try and be an asset in your community. Try and mobilize other local leaders. Get a little town hall together. Reach out to the head of the baseball organization. I talked about this a little bit earlier. The soccer organization, the top 6 or 7, providers of sports in your community. Reach out to the PE teacher, to the principal. call a little, get the high school auditorium together, have a community conversation about how we feel like we're doing sports in our community. And what are the outcomes that we really want to achieve? What does good look like? What do we want this particular town to be? And what type of kids are being left behind? And how can we do it better? Just get that conversation started. Feel free to use our, framework, our 8 strategies to audit yourself. How well are we doing in asking kids what they want? How well are we doing in training coaches? How well are we doing in incorporating free play? How well are we doing with our in-town leagues? Just get that conversation started. Begin to set some goals, and then try and get folks to begin to make commitments off of those type of goals. So it's basically what we call in the nonprofit space collective impact methodology. It's a 5-step methodology on how do you address a complex social problem, but with measurables and continuous communication channels. And stay tuned with us. We're fortunate that a large media company that I used to work for is going to support the development of these community action toolkits, which will basically digitize this whole process. We're just at the front end of putting together such a tool, but it should sort of templatize and make plug and play this whole process of mobilizing local leaders. So, yeah, stay tuned.
So the name of the book on the parenting issue generally just came to me, The Price of Privilege. The Price of Privilege. So I would recommend that to you in addition to books written by the panelists, which I think are excellent. I won't name them, but very worthwhile. Then finally, I'd just like to say, this is therapy for the 3 of us. We can't talk about these issues enough, particularly with a group like this that is thoughtful and engaged and really wants to make a difference. So I think we owe you thanks for being here today, and also to Nicole and to the Sport and Society Initiative.
Someday we'll be an institute.
Initiative for bringing us together today here. It's been fantastic. I think we've all enjoyed it tremendously.
Well, my church, go ahead.
You have to tell Vince Story that I brought the beard in his,
Okay, I will
in
tell
his
him
honor.
that. I
Okay?
will tell him
Yeah,
that.
all right.
And my charge for you is to follow us. So the Sports and Society Initiative, this is one of many discussions that we're going to hold on this topic and many others. We'll be contacting everyone who signed up outside with a list of resources that includes a link to all of the books that they've mentioned, Dave's book included, and to Sean's article and other articles that have been written. And we want to continue this as a dialogue, so we really feel that this is our charge, is to help drive your charge and to help drive change in our community. So we'll be in touch with you. We hope that you will stay in touch with us, because together we really can all make a difference. Can I have a big round of applause for our panelists? And please eat our cookies, drink our whatever's back there, and thank you so much for coming.